Welcome to Sinister Memory. If you're new here, subscribe now and let us know in the comments where you're listening to this story. Let's get to today's story. The autumn of 1852 brought with it an unseasonable chill to the Hudson Valley, where the Van Holt estate sprawled across 300 acres of rolling hills and ancient woodlands. Dr. Nathaniel Pierce, the county coroner, would later describe his arrival at Ravenscroft Manor as stepping into a tableau of deliberate decay, where nature and neglect had conspired to create something far more unsettling than mere abandonment. The letter that summoned Dr. Pierce had arrived at his Albany office on a Tuesday morning, bearing the seal of the county sheriff and written in the careful script of Deputy Marshal Thomas Crane. The message was brief but troubling. The Van Holt family mausoleum had been discovered in a state of violent disturbance, with evidence suggesting the stone sarcophagi had been opened from within. The local constabulary required immediate medical examination of the remains found scattered throughout the burial chamber. Pierce had known the Van Holt name, as did most residents of the Hudson Valley. The family had amassed considerable wealth through shipping ventures and land speculation during the early decades of the century. Reginald Van Holt, the patriarch, had been a man of rigid propriety and calculated ambition, while his wife, Constance, was remembered for her charitable works among the poor of Albany and her patronage of local artists. Their only child, Eleanor, had been the subject of considerable speculation among society circles, particularly after her parents' sudden deaths in the winter of 1851. The estate itself bore the hallmarks of recent prosperity suddenly curtailed. The main house, an imposing federal-style mansion constructed of local limestone, stood intact but showed signs of hasty abandonment. Windows remained shuttered, and the formal gardens had surrendered to an aggressive tangle of wild growth that seemed to have claimed the property with unusual speed. Most disturbing to Pierce was the complete absence of caretakers or groundskeepers, positions that would typically be maintained even during periods of family absence. The mausoleum occupied a prominent position on a gentle rise, approximately 200 yards from the main house. Constructed in the Greek Revival style favored by wealthy families of the period, the structure featured 4 Doric columns supporting a triangular pediment carved with the Van Holt coat of arms. The bronze doors, normally secured with heavy locks, hung open at unnatural angles, their hinges twisted as though forced from within by tremendous pressure. Pierce's initial examination of the interior revealed a scene that challenged his considerable experience with unusual deaths. The marble sarcophagi of Reginald and Constance Van Holt had been displaced from their positions, with the heavy stone lids found several feet from their bases. Deep scratches scarred the interior surfaces of both tombs, and fragments of fingernails and dried blood adhered to the stone. Most peculiar were the positions of the remains themselves, which suggested the deceased had not been at rest when the tombs were sealed. The official death certificates, which Pierce retrieved from county records, indicated that both Reginald and Constance had succumbed to a sudden fever during the harsh winter of 1851. The attending physician, Dr. Horatio Fleming, had noted symptoms consistent with pneumonia, though his records contained several unusual observations regarding the rapidity of the illness and certain physical manifestations he declined to describe in detail. Both deaths had occurred within hours of each other, and the bodies had been interred with unusual haste, despite the frozen ground that typically delayed winter burials. Eleanor Van Holt's whereabouts remained unknown. Neighbors reported that she had departed the estate shortly after her parents' funeral, leaving instructions with the household staff that she would be traveling abroad indefinitely. The servants themselves had been dismissed within days of her departure, each provided with generous severance and sworn to discretion regarding family affairs. No forwarding address had been established, and inquiries to shipping companies and hotels in New York City had yielded no trace of her movements. The local pastor, Reverend Isaiah Blackthorne, provided the most disturbing testimony regarding the family's final months. He described Eleanor's behavior during her parents' illness as unnaturally composed, noting her insistence on personally attending to their care and her refusal to allow other family members or medical professionals extended access to the sick room. The funeral service itself had been conducted with minimal attendance at Eleanor's specific request, and she had remained at the graveside long after other mourners had departed. As Pierce concluded his preliminary examination of the mausoleum, the lengthening shadows of late afternoon cast the interior in deeper gloom. The evidence suggested a horror that challenged rational explanation, yet the methodical nature of the scene implied careful planning rather than supernatural intervention. The truth of what had transpired at Ravenscroft Manor would require deeper investigation into the Van Holt family's final winter together, and the true nature of Eleanor's devotion to her parents. Dr. Pierce's investigation into the Van Holt family's final months began with a careful examination of the household records maintained by the estate's former housekeeper, Mrs. Abigail Thornton. The woman had served the family for nearly 2 decades before her abrupt dismissal in February of 1852, and her meticulous documentation of daily affairs provided disturbing insights into the household's gradual transformation during the winter preceding the tragedy. According to Mrs. Thornton's records, the first signs of disturbance manifested in late November of 1851. When Eleanor began requesting that all meals be prepared in the kitchen but delivered to her personally for distribution to family members. This departure from established protocol initially appeared to stem from concern for her parents' declining health, yet the housekeeper noted that neither Reginald nor Constance had shown symptoms of illness at that time. Eleanor's explanation centered on her desire to ensure proper nutrition during the approaching winter months, though her selections of foods became increasingly peculiar. The household staff observed that Eleanor's nocturnal activities intensified throughout December. Kitchen servants reported finding evidence of late-night cooking sessions, with pots and utensils arranged in configurations that served no apparent culinary purpose. The pantry, normally well stocked with preserved goods for winter consumption, began to show unusual depletions, particularly of herbs and medicinal preparations that had been stored for household remedies. Most troubling was the discovery of small glass vials hidden throughout the house, containing substances that the staff could not identify, but which produced a bitter, metallic odor when disturbed. Mrs. Thornton's final entries, dated in early January of 1852, described a household atmosphere of increasing tension and secrecy. Eleanor had begun locking the doors to her parents' chambers during daylight hours, claiming they required extended rest to recover from their mounting fatigue. The family's longtime physician, Dr. Fleming, was permitted only brief visits, and these occurred exclusively in Eleanor's presence. Staff members noted that the doctor appeared increasingly troubled after each consultation, though professional discretion prevented him from discussing his concerns with household employees. The estate's groundskeeper, Henrik Larsson, provided additional testimony regarding the family's final weeks. Larsson had maintained the Van Holt property for 15 years and possessed intimate knowledge of the family's routines and preferences. His observations focused primarily on Eleanor's frequent visits to the family mausoleum during January and early February, often occurring during the coldest hours of night when the ground lay frozen beneath several feet of snow. These midnight excursions followed a consistent pattern that Larsson documented with growing unease. Eleanor would emerge from the main house carrying a lantern and a leather satchel, proceeding directly to the mausoleum despite treacherous conditions that would normally discourage such journeys. She remained within the structure for periods ranging from 1 to 3 hours, during which Larsson occasionally observed flickering lights through the small windows set high in the walls. Upon her return to the house, Eleanor's clothing often bore stains that appeared dark against the snow, though the poor lighting prevented clear identification of their nature. The mausoleum itself had been constructed according to Eleanor's specifications following her grandfather's death in 1848. Unlike traditional burial chambers designed for permanent interment, the Van Holt Mausoleum featured several unusual elements that would later prove significant to Pierce's investigation. The structure included an elaborate ventilation system with concealed air passages, ostensibly designed to preserve the integrity of the marble sarcophagi. More peculiar was the installation of a complex locking mechanism that could be operated from within the chamber, a feature that Eleanor had insisted upon despite the architect's protests regarding its impracticality. Dr. Fleming's private correspondence, discovered among his papers following his own death from apoplexy in March of 1852, revealed the depth of his concerns regarding the Van Holt family's condition. His letters to a colleague in Boston described symptoms that defied conventional medical understanding, including progressive weakness accompanied by periods of unusual lucidity, skin discoloration that appeared and disappeared without apparent cause, and behavioral changes that suggested the influence of unknown substances. Most disturbing were Fleming's observations regarding Eleanor's demeanor during his final visits to the estate. He described her as possessing an unnatural composure that bordered on euphoria, despite the obvious deterioration of her parents' health. Her questions regarding the progression of various illnesses demonstrated knowledge that exceeded what might be expected from a dutiful daughter, particularly her inquiries about the precise timing of organ failure and the physical manifestations of different forms of poisoning. The winter's climax arrived with the sudden deaths of Reginald and Constance Van Holt on February 14, 1852. The timing, occurring during the season's most severe blizzard, necessitated temporary preservation of the bodies within the estate until ground conditions permitted burial. Eleanor insisted on personally preparing her parents for interment, dismissing the services of the local undertaker and working alone in the estate's cold cellar for 3 days before declaring the bodies ready for transport to the mausoleum. Dr. Pierce's examination of the medical evidence surrounding the Van Holt deaths required careful analysis of Dr. Fleming's clinical notes, which had been preserved in the physician's private study following his unexpected demise. The documents revealed a progressive deterioration in the doctor's handwriting and mental state during his final visits to Ravenscroft Manor, suggesting that his exposure to the family's condition had profoundly affected his own well-being. Fleming's initial assessment of Reginald Van Holt, dated December 15, 1851, described a robust man of 58 years experiencing mild respiratory distress and occasional episodes of disorientation. The symptoms appeared consistent with seasonal influenza, though the physician noted several anomalies that troubled his professional judgment. Reginald's pulse exhibited irregular patterns that seemed to correlate with his proximity to certain areas of the house, particularly the dining room and his private study. More puzzling was the patient's intermittent lucidity, during which he expressed concerns about his daughter's behavior that he could not articulate clearly when questioned directly. Constance Van Holt's condition, as documented in Fleming's notes from the same period, presented similar contradictions. The 54-year-old woman displayed symptoms of progressive weakness and periodic confusion, yet retained perfect clarity regarding events from her distant past, while struggling to recall recent conversations or activities. Her physical examination revealed no obvious signs of organic disease, though Fleming observed unusual discoloration around her fingernails and a persistent metallic taste that she reported experiencing after meals. The physician's growing suspicions became evident in his correspondence with Dr. Josiah Crane, a toxicologist at Harvard Medical College, Fleming's letters, written in increasingly urgent tones throughout January of 1852, described his attempts to identify the source of his patients' mysterious ailments. He had begun secretly collecting samples of food, water, and medicine from the Van Holt household, though his analysis capabilities were limited by the rural location and lack of sophisticated laboratory equipment. Eleanor's role in her parents' care became a central focus of Fleming's concerns. His notes described her as exceptionally knowledgeable regarding medical procedures and pharmaceutical preparations, demonstrating familiarity with compounds and treatments that exceeded what might be expected from casual study. She insisted on preparing all medications personally, claiming that her parents responded better to remedies she compounded according to recipes inherited from her grandmother. Fleming's attempts to examine these preparations were consistently thwarted by Eleanor's explanations that the formulations required immediate consumption to maintain their efficacy. The physician's final visit to the estate, recorded on February 10th, 1852, documented a dramatic acceleration in both patients' decline. Reginald had developed severe tremors and exhibited signs of delirium, while Constance appeared to be entering a catatonic state, punctuated by brief periods of desperate alertness. Most disturbing to Fleming was the patients' apparent terror when left alone with their daughter, though they seemed unable to communicate the source of their distress when Eleanor was absent from the room. Fleming's private journal, discovered hidden within a false compartment of his desk, contained observations that he had deemed too inflammatory for official medical records. These entries described his growing conviction that the Van Holt parents were being systematically poisoned, though he lacked sufficient evidence to support formal accusations. His attempts to involve local authorities had been frustrated by Eleanor's social standing and the family's considerable influence within the community. The physician's investigation into historical precedents for the symptoms he observed led him to research cases of chronic arsenic poisoning, though the Van Holt patient's condition included elements that did not conform to established patterns. His correspondence with colleagues in Boston and New York revealed similar cases occurring sporadically throughout New England, always involving wealthy families and invariably resulting in deaths that appeared natural despite suspicious circumstances. Of particular significance was Fleming's discovery of a medical text in Eleanor's possession, a rare volume titled Botanical Toxicology of the Americas by Dr. Hieronymus Voss, published in Vienna in 1847. The book contained detailed descriptions of plant-based compounds that could produce delayed effects mimicking natural illness, along with precise dosage calculations for achieving specific symptoms without immediate fatality. Eleanor's explanation for possessing such a text centered on her interest in botanical remedies for common ailments, though Fleming noted extensive marginalia in her handwriting throughout the sections dealing with lethal applications. The physician's final journal entry, dated February 13th of 1852, revealed his intention to confront Eleanor directly regarding his suspicions. He had prepared a detailed report for the county sheriff and arranged for samples of the patient's hair and fingernails to be sent to Boston for chemical analysis. His plans included removing both parents from the estate under the pretense of requiring specialized treatment in Albany, though he acknowledged the difficulty of convincing them to leave their daughter's care. Fleming's death from apparent apoplexy occurred before he could implement these measures, leaving his evidence scattered and his suspicions unsubstantiated. The timing of his demise, occurring less than 1 month after the Van Holt deaths, would later prompt Pierce to question whether the physician's investigation had made him a target for elimination. Dr. Pierce's investigation into the Van Holt Mausoleum's unusual construction led him to the architectural firm of Morrison and Associates in Albany, where the original blueprints revealed modifications that defied conventional burial chamber design. The project's supervising architect, Jeremiah Morrison, had maintained detailed correspondence with Eleanor Van Holt throughout the construction process, documenting her increasingly specific and troubling requests for features that served no apparent funerary purpose. The initial commission, dated September 1848, described a traditional family mausoleum designed to accommodate 4 generations of Van Holt remains. Morrison's preliminary sketches depicted a classical structure with standard ventilation, drainage, and security features appropriate for a family of the Van Holt's social standing. The estimated construction cost of $1,200 reflected the quality materials and craftsmanship expected for such a project, though Eleanor's subsequent modifications would ultimately triple the final expense. Eleanor's first alteration request, submitted in October 1848, focused on the internal locking mechanism. Standard mausoleum doors featured external locks designed to prevent unauthorized entry while ensuring that legitimate access remained possible for maintenance and future interments. Eleanor insisted on a complex system that could be operated from within the chamber, claiming that family tradition required the ability to secure the tomb from the inside during certain ceremonial observances. Morrison's correspondence with his engineering consultant revealed significant technical challenges in implementing such a system while maintaining the structural integrity of the bronze doors. The ventilation modifications proved even more perplexing to the architectural team. Eleanor requested an elaborate network of concealed air passages that extended far beyond the minimal requirements for preserving marble sarcophagi. Her specifications called for adjustable vents that could be controlled from within the chamber, along with secondary passages that connected to the main house through underground tunnels. When Morrison questioned the necessity of such extensive ventilation, Eleanor explained that the system would prevent the accumulation of noxious gases that might affect visitors during extended vigils with deceased family members. Construction began in November 1848, with Eleanor maintaining daily oversight of the project despite the approaching winter weather. The workers, primarily Irish immigrants employed by Morrison's firm, reported unusual behavior from the young woman that extended beyond normal client supervision. She insisted on personally inspecting each stone before installation and required that certain sections be rebuilt multiple times to achieve specifications that appeared arbitrary to the craftsman. Most disturbing was her practice of spending entire nights within the partially completed structure, claiming to test the acoustics and airflow patterns. The underground tunnel system presented the greatest construction challenge and attracted the most attention from local residents. Eleanor's design called for a passage extending from the mausoleum's foundation to the estate's wine cellar, a distance of approximately 200 yards through rocky soil that required extensive excavation. The official purpose, according to Eleanor's explanation, was to provide discreet access for family members who wished to visit the tomb without being observed by estate staff or neighbors. The tunnel's dimensions, however, were sufficient to accommodate a wheeled cart or stretcher, suggesting applications beyond simple pedestrian access. Morrison's private notes, discovered among his firm's archives, revealed growing unease with Eleanor's behavior as construction progressed through the winter months. She demonstrated knowledge of masonry techniques and structural engineering that exceeded what might be expected from an educated woman of her social class. Her questions regarding load-bearing calculations and foundation stability suggested familiarity with construction principles typically acquired through professional training or extensive practical experience. Most troubling was her insistence on personally mixing certain mortar compounds, claiming that family recipes produced superior results despite the additional expense and labor involved. The project's completion in March 1849 coincided with several unusual incidents that Morrison documented but never fully understood. Workers reported finding personal items within the sealed walls during final inspections, including jewelry, documents, and small containers that Eleanor claimed were traditional offerings to ensure the structure's spiritual protection. The discovery of a complete set of medical instruments concealed within a false compartment behind one of the marble panels prompted questions that Eleanor deflected with references to historical family practices regarding the preparation of deceased relatives. The mausoleum's consecration ceremony, conducted by Reverend Blackthorne in April 1849, attracted minimal attendance despite the Van Holt family's prominent social position. Eleanor had insisted on a private blessing with only immediate family members present, though observers noted that she remained within the structure long after the brief service concluded. The Reverend's subsequent comments to Morrison suggested that the interior arrangement differed significantly from the approved blueprints, though specific details of these modifications were never documented. Morrison's final correspondence with Eleanor, dated May 1849, addressed her request for additional modifications to the locking mechanism. She claimed that the current system required adjustment to ensure proper operation during emergency situations, though her description of potential emergencies remained vague and unsettling. The architect's response indicated his reluctance to continue working on the project, citing professional concerns about the structure's increasingly unconventional features and their potential implications for public safety. The testimony of the Van Holt household staff, gathered through Pierce's methodical interviews with former employees, revealed a pattern of psychological manipulation and gradual isolation that had transformed the estate into a prison of Eleanor's design. Mrs. Abigail Thornton, the dismissed housekeeper, provided the most comprehensive account of the household's deterioration during the months preceding the tragedy. Her recollections preserved in a detailed statement she had prepared for her own protection following her abrupt dismissal. The kitchen staff, consisting of cook Margaret O'Brien and her assistant Catherine Malloy, described Eleanor's increasing control over food preparation as extending far beyond normal household management. Beginning in November 1851, Eleanor had instituted new protocols requiring that all ingredients be inspected and approved before use, claiming concern for her parents' delicate constitutions during their recovery from minor ailments. The women noted that Eleanor's knowledge of herbs and medicinal plants exceeded their own considerable experience. Though her selections often included specimens they could not identify despite decades of cooking for wealthy families. Eleanor's nocturnal activities in the kitchen became a source of particular unease among the staff. O'Brien reported discovering evidence of extensive food preparation occurring during the early morning hours, with pots, utensils, and cutting boards arranged in configurations that suggested complex processes requiring multiple stages of preparation. The cook's attempts to maintain her usual routines were increasingly frustrated by Eleanor's insistence that certain areas of the kitchen remain undisturbed, claiming that delicate preparations required specific conditions of temperature and humidity that could be disrupted by normal cleaning activities. The household's laundry staff provided disturbing observations regarding Eleanor's clothing and personal effects during the winter months. Mary Flanagan, the head laundress, noted unusual stains on Eleanor's garments that required specialized treatment to remove, though the young woman's explanations attributed these marks to her botanical studies and charitable work among the local poor. More troubling was the discovery of small glass vials sewn into hidden pockets of Eleanor's dresses, containers that produced a sharp, medicinal odor when accidentally broken during washing. The estate's stablemaster, Patrick Donovan, documented Eleanor's frequent requests for transportation to remote areas of the Hudson Valley, ostensibly for collecting botanical specimens and visiting isolated families in need of medical assistance. These expeditions often occurred during severe weather conditions that would normally discourage travel, and Eleanor consistently refused offers of escort or companionship. Donovan noted that she returned from these journeys carrying leather satchels that appeared heavier than when she departed, though her explanations focused on medicinal plants and charitable supplies rather than items that would account for the increased weight. The gradual dismissal of long-term staff members began in December 1851, with Eleanor citing economic concerns and her parents' preference for privacy during their convalescence. Each departure followed a similar pattern, with generous severance payments accompanied by strict confidentiality agreements that prohibited discussion of household affairs with outsiders. The remaining servants observed that those who questioned Eleanor's decisions or expressed concern about the family's welfare were invariably the first to receive dismissal notices, creating an atmosphere of fearful compliance among the remaining staff. Henrik Larsson, the groundskeeper, provided crucial testimony regarding Eleanor's activities in the estate's extensive gardens and greenhouse facilities. His observations documented her cultivation of plants that served no decorative or culinary purpose, many of which required specialized care and produced flowers or fruits that Larsson recognized as potentially dangerous. Eleanor's explanations emphasized her interest in botanical medicine and her desire to create remedies for common ailments, though her selection of species included several that Larsson knew to be highly toxic even in small quantities. The greenhouse itself had been modified under Eleanor's supervision to accommodate plants requiring specific environmental conditions. New sections featured controlled temperature and humidity systems that allowed for the cultivation of tropical and subtropical species unsuited to the Hudson Valley climate. Most disturbing to Larsson was Eleanor's insistence on personally tending these plants, often working alone during nighttime hours when the greenhouse's interior remained hidden from casual observation. The staff's collective testimony painted a portrait of systematic isolation and control that extended beyond normal household management into something approaching imprisonment. Eleanor's parents, once active in local social circles and charitable organizations, had gradually withdrawn from all external contact during the autumn and winter of 1851. Their correspondence ceased, social visits were declined, and even long-time family friends were turned away with explanations of illness and the need for extended rest. The final weeks before the staff's dismissal were characterized by an atmosphere of mounting tension and unspoken dread. Servants reported hearing unusual sounds from the family quarters during nighttime hours, including what appeared to be muffled calls for assistance that ceased abruptly when investigated. Eleanor's explanations attributed these disturbances to her parents' restless sleep and occasional delirium, though the frequency and intensity of such episodes suggested something far more troubling than ordinary illness. Dr. Pierce's collaboration with Professor Augustus Hartley of Columbia College's Department of Natural Philosophy yielded disturbing revelations about the substances discovered throughout the Van Holt estate. The professor's expertise in analytical chemistry, combined with access to the college's newly acquired spectroscopic equipment, enabled detailed examination of samples collected from the Mausoleum, the main house, and Eleanor's personal effects recovered from her abandoned chambers. The initial analysis focused on residues found within the glass vials, discovered in Eleanor's clothing and hidden throughout the estate. Professor Hartley's preliminary tests identified traces of several alkaloid compounds derived from plants native to both North and South America, many of which required sophisticated extraction processes to achieve the concentrations found in the samples. The presence of these substances suggested access to specialized knowledge and equipment that exceeded the capabilities of typical domestic preparation methods. Most significant was the identification of compounds extracted from Datura stramonium, commonly known as Jimson weed, combined with derivatives of Aconitum napellus, or monk's hood. This particular combination produced effects that closely matched the symptoms described in Dr. Fleming's medical notes, including progressive weakness, disorientation, and periods of apparent lucidity, followed by deeper confusion. Professor Hartley's research into historical cases revealed similar compound usage in several unexplained deaths throughout Europe during the previous century, though documentation remained fragmentary due to the limited analytical capabilities of earlier periods. The examination of food residues collected from the Van Holt kitchen revealed a more complex pattern of contamination. Traces of the same alkaloid compounds appeared in preserved samples of bread, soup, and wine, though the concentrations varied significantly between different food items. Professor Hartley's analysis suggested a deliberate program of gradual poisoning designed to produce chronic symptoms that would mimic natural illness while avoiding the acute effects that might prompt immediate medical intervention or suspicion. Particularly disturbing was the discovery of metallic compounds within the food samples, specifically derivatives of mercury and lead that had been processed into forms that would dissolve readily in acidic solutions. These substances, when combined with the plant-based alkaloids, created a synergistic effect that accelerated the progression of symptoms while making accurate diagnosis nearly impossible using conventional medical examination techniques available in 1852. The analysis of materials collected from Eleanor's botanical laboratory, established in the estate's converted conservatory, revealed the extent of her chemical knowledge and preparation capabilities. Professor Hartley identified equipment and supplies that indicated familiarity with advanced distillation, extraction, and purification processes typically associated with professional pharmaceutical or research facilities. The presence of rare chemicals imported from European suppliers suggested significant financial investment in creating a sophisticated poison manufacturing operation. Eleanor's personal library, examined in conjunction with the chemical evidence, contained volumes that provided crucial context for understanding her methods and motivations. Professor Hartley noted particular attention to works on toxicology, botanical medicine, and forensic chemistry, many of which contained extensive marginalia in Eleanor's handwriting. Her annotations demonstrated progressive understanding of complex chemical interactions and dosage calculations that would have required months or years of dedicated study to master. The examination of samples collected from the mausoleum itself yielded perhaps the most horrifying discoveries. Residues found on the interior surfaces of the sarcophagi contained the same alkaloid compounds identified elsewhere, though in concentrations that suggested the substances had been applied directly to the stone surfaces rather than introduced through contaminated food or drink. Professor Hartley's analysis indicated that these compounds would have produced severe respiratory distress and paralysis in anyone exposed to them within the confined space of the sealed tomb. The ventilation system that Eleanor had insisted on installing proved to have a dual purpose that became apparent through chemical analysis. While the passages did provide air circulation, they also contained residues of compounds that would have created a toxic atmosphere within the mausoleum when activated. The adjustable vents that Eleanor had specified allowed for precise control of airflow and chemical concentration, enabling her to regulate the effects experienced by anyone trapped within the chamber. Professor Hartley's final report, submitted to Dr. Pierce in November 1852, concluded that the evidence demonstrated a systematic program of poisoning that had been planned and executed with scientific precision. The combination of substances used, the methods of delivery, and the sophisticated equipment required for their preparation indicated that Eleanor Van Holt possessed knowledge and capabilities that far exceeded what might be expected from an amateur enthusiast of botanical medicine. The professor's recommendation for immediate criminal prosecution was complicated by Eleanor's continued absence and the lack of witnesses to the actual administration of the toxic compounds. The reconstruction of the Van Holt family's final days emerged through careful analysis of physical evidence, witness testimony, and Eleanor's own journal, discovered hidden within a false panel of her writing desk. The leather-bound volume, written in Eleanor's precise script, provided a chilling account of her methodical approach to what she termed her great work of liberation, though the true nature of her motivations remained shrouded in philosophical abstractions and disturbing rationalizations. Eleanor's journal entries from February 1852 revealed a mind consumed with elaborate justifications for actions that she viewed as necessary corrections to what she perceived as cosmic imbalances within her family structure. Her writings described her parents as prisoners of their own material success, trapped within social conventions that prevented them from achieving what she termed authentic existence. The journal's tone suggested a person who had convinced herself that murder represented an act of mercy rather than malice. The events of February 12, 1852, began with Eleanor's final preparation of what she euphemistically referred to as her parents' transition medicine. Her journal described the careful measurement and combination of compounds that would produce the desired effects without causing immediate death, allowing for what she considered a period of spiritual preparation before their physical departure. The substances, administered through their evening meal, were calculated to induce progressive paralysis while maintaining consciousness, ensuring that her parents would remain aware during the final stages of her plan. Dr. Pierce's examination of the dining room revealed evidence supporting Eleanor's written account of that final dinner. Residue analysis confirmed the presence of the same toxic compounds identified throughout the investigation, though in concentrations that would have produced rapid onset of symptoms. The table setting, preserved exactly as it had been left, showed signs of a meal interrupted by sudden illness, with overturned glasses and scattered silverware indicating the moment when Eleanor's parents realized their condition. The journal's description of the following hours detailed Eleanor's careful monitoring of her parents' deteriorating condition as the paralytic agents took effect. She recorded their progression through various stages of incapacitation with clinical detachment, noting the timing of specific symptoms and adjusting her timeline accordingly. Her writings revealed particular satisfaction with the accuracy of her dosage calculations, which had achieved the precise balance between consciousness and helplessness that her plan required. February 13th marked the beginning of what Eleanor termed the sacred transition, during which she transported her paralyzed but conscious parents to the mausoleum through the underground tunnel she had commissioned during the structure's construction. The journal described this process as a ceremonial procession, with Eleanor viewing herself as a priestess conducting ancient rites of passage. Her parents' inability to resist or call for help was interpreted as acceptance of their fate rather than the result of chemical paralysis. The mausoleum's interior had been prepared according to Eleanor's detailed specifications, with the sarcophagi arranged to accommodate living occupants rather than corpses. The ventilation system, modified to allow for controlled introduction of additional toxic compounds, enabled Eleanor to regulate her parents' final hours with scientific precision. Her journal recorded their placement within the marble tombs while still breathing, describing their expressions of terror as evidence of their spiritual awakening to the truth of their existence. Eleanor's account of sealing the sarcophagi revealed the full extent of her psychological detachment from the reality of her actions. She described the process as completing a sacred ritual that would free her parents from the burdens of material existence, while allowing them to achieve a higher form of consciousness through their suffering. The journal's tone suggested genuine belief that she was performing an act of love rather than committing murder, indicating a complete break from conventional moral reasoning. The final journal entry, dated February 14th, 1852, documented Eleanor's departure from the estate following confirmation of her parents' deaths. She described listening at the mausoleum's ventilation system until the sounds of movement and muffled cries ceased, interpreting the silence as evidence of successful transition to a higher plane of existence. Her preparations for leaving included destroying most physical evidence while preserving selected items as what she termed sacred relics of her accomplishment. Eleanor's destination remained unknown, though her journal contained references to correspondents in European cities who shared her philosophical perspectives on death and transcendence. The final pages suggested plans for continuing her work among other families, whom she viewed as similarly trapped by material concerns, indicating that the Van Holt murders might represent the beginning rather than the conclusion of her campaign of liberation. Dr. Pierce's investigation concluded in the winter of 1853 with the publication of his official report to the Hudson County authorities. Though the document raised more questions than it answered regarding Eleanor Van Holt's ultimate fate and the broader implications of her crimes. The report, classified as confidential due to its disturbing content and potential impact on public safety, documented the most methodical case of familial murder in the region's recorded history, while acknowledging the complete absence of the perpetrator herself. The search for Eleanor had extended across multiple states and into international territories, with inquiries sent to shipping companies, hotels, and boarding houses throughout the eastern seaboard and major European ports. Detective agencies in New York, Boston, and Philadelphia had been engaged to pursue leads that consistently proved fruitless, as though Eleanor had simply dissolved into the anonymous masses of travelers and immigrants that characterized the period's mobile population. Her considerable inheritance, accessed through a series of carefully planned financial transactions completed before her departure, provided resources sufficient to sustain an indefinite period of concealment. The most promising lead emerged from a boarding house proprietor in Charleston, South Carolina, who reported hosting a young woman matching Eleanor's description during March of 1852. The guest had registered under the name Catherine Morrison and claimed to be traveling south for health reasons, though her behavior and extensive luggage suggested purposes beyond simple recuperation. Most significantly, the proprietor noted her guest's unusual interest in local botanical specimens and her frequent correspondence with addresses in European cities, particularly Vienna and Prague. Further investigation revealed a pattern of similar sightings, extending southward through Georgia and into Florida, where Eleanor appeared to have boarded a merchant vessel bound for the Caribbean islands. Ship manifests from the period showed a passenger named Catherine Morrison traveling to Havana in April of 1852, though subsequent attempts to trace her movements through Cuban authorities proved unsuccessful due to the political instability affecting the region during that period. The European connection gained substance through correspondence discovered among Eleanor's abandoned papers, revealing extensive communication with individuals who shared her philosophical perspectives on death, suffering, and what she termed spiritual liberation. These letters, written in multiple languages and employing coded references that suggested clandestine activities, indicated Eleanor's involvement with a broader network of like-minded individuals who viewed conventional morality as an obstacle to human enlightenment. Professor Hartley's continued analysis of Eleanor's chemical knowledge led to disturbing discoveries regarding similar cases throughout Europe during the previous decades. His research identified at least 6 instances of unexplained family deaths involving symptoms consistent with the compounds used in the Van Holt murders, all occurring in wealthy households where young women had been present as relatives, companions, or domestic staff. The pattern suggested either an organized conspiracy or the influence of shared knowledge and techniques among individuals pursuing similar objectives. The Van Holt estate itself became a source of ongoing concern for local authorities, as the property's abandonment attracted curiosity seekers and potential vandals drawn by rumors of hidden treasures and supernatural phenomena. The Mausoleum, sealed by court order following Pierce's investigation, continued to generate reports of unusual activities, including strange lights, unexplained sounds, and the persistent odor of chemical compounds that defied natural explanation. Several attempts to demolish the structure were abandoned due to technical difficulties and the workers' reluctance to continue after experiencing what they described as overwhelming feelings of dread and nausea. The broader implications of Eleanor's crimes extended beyond the immediate tragedy to raise questions about the education and supervision of young women from wealthy families. Her case prompted discussions among medical professionals, educators, and social reformers regarding the potential dangers of providing extensive scientific education without corresponding moral guidance. The availability of toxic plants and chemical compounds through legitimate commercial channels also attracted scrutiny from authorities concerned about preventing similar crimes. Dr. Pierce's personal reflections, recorded in his private journal following completion of the official investigation, revealed the profound impact that the case had exerted on his understanding of human nature and the potential for evil to manifest within apparently civilized society. His writings described Eleanor Van Holt as representing a new category of criminal, one whose actions stemmed not from passion, greed, or desperation, but from a calculated philosophical position that viewed murder as a form of enlightened intervention in the natural order. The final entry in Pierce's journal, dated December 31st, 1853, acknowledged the likelihood that Eleanor Van Holt remained at large somewhere in the world, possibly continuing her work among other unsuspecting families. His recommendation for continued vigilance among medical professionals and law enforcement agencies reflected his conviction that the Van Holt case represented not an isolated incident, but the first documented example of a phenomenon that might emerge again wherever education, opportunity, and moral corruption converged in a single individual possessed of sufficient intelligence and determination to transform philosophical abstractions into murderous reality. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Sinister Memory. If you enjoyed today's investigation, subscribe to our channel and ring the notification bell to be alerted when we unveil our next dark chronicle. Share your thoughts about this case in the comments below. We read every single one, and your ideas often lead us to our next investigation. Until next time.